Hello, folks, and welcome to Totally Tank, the tankiest podcast in Tankville. I'm Rob.
And hello, folks, I'm John, and this is episode 72, recording and streaming live on 19 July 2025. Rob, we had someone on Spotify the other day thank us for putting the date stamps at the start of the episodes because he was on the old Panther episode.
There you go.
Yes. Okay, now, if you haven't already, please head over to totallytank.net and sign up for the email list or the RSS feed so we can let you know about updates without having to beg permission from the fascist oligarchs who own social media. Also, if you like the show, for God's sake, smash those like and subscribe buttons and leave positive reviews, 5 stars, please. And we just want to say a big hello to Beckett, if he's on the line, who has permission to stay up for the show as he's on school holidays.
G'day, Beckett.
Good to see the family's well organised there. Speaking of Beckett, in our monthly Guess the Tank contest, Beckett has been known to correctly guess the serial number of the featured tank, not just the type.
Now, we just want to say hello to all our the folks on the chat. It's Alan Hans Vornhat, sorry.
Mm-hmm.
And for those who want to jump in and join the poll, whether or not the AMX-30 was the Gallic genius or the worst tank of the Cold War. So yes, that's the tank we're doing today, is the AMX-30, built by the French, or as the French would call it. John, this one's coming.
What?
Ateliers.
Atelier Deconstruction d'Issy les Molineux. Molineux is the place, and Atelier it's the factory.
Yep.
The Molineux factory is what AMX basically just means. Yes. So that's fantastic.
Which is what where the AMX comes from, and 30 cents, where it was supposed to be 30 tons. Now, being Strine and inconsistent with my accent, I will pronounce it as both France and as France, as the wind takes me. And all measurements will be in metric, besides how tall people are, which is the only useful imperial measurement left. And the organisation of the Treaty of the Atlantic North will be listed as OTAN, as the French is the other official language of that organisation. Clarifying for folks why OTAN is listed with the English language version of that organisation.
Okay, I was confused looking through the run sheet who these OTAN people were. But
I know, I'd never heard of this. I'd always seen it with that other organisation, but never realised why OTAN was there with it. And that is why, because French is the other official language of that organisation, and which is why it's OTAN.
Now, just referencing our viewers who are on the line, Alan is asking if the French eat white cheese, does it naturally turn yellow? I believe it does, actually, Alan. And Hans wants to know if the French have as robust a reverse gear as history would have him believe. And actually, in this case, it does.
Yeah, I was about to say. I read that and I thought, what didn't come from my source I think came from War Thunder, saying they had 5 forward and 5 reverse gears. And I was thinking to myself, that sounds like a bit of a dig myself, but no, supposedly that's how that's actually built.
It might be one of those gearboxes where it just it just chucks a reversing cog in so that whatever the front gears do, the reverse gears can do the other way. But yeah.
Yeah. All right. Stats. And because they were so similar in design and time, there will be comparisons to the Leopard 1.
Many comparisons to Leopard 1. Most of them adverse, but yeah.
Just to highlight the differences between the two tanks, because they came out at the same time and in service. So in service from 1966 to present, a year later than the Leopard 1, which came out in 1965. They were produced from 1966 through to 1994, which was 10 years longer than the Leopard 1, which stopped production in 1984. They built 3,571 versus, again, 6,500 of the Leopard 1 specifications, only 36 tons, so still 6 tons over what it was.
3,500, sorry, it's a lot for a French tank.
Oh, yeah, no, I mean, the French make a lot of tanks. It's a case of, it wasn't a small run of tanks, it's much more bigger than Chieftains and early British tanks. All right, so 36 tons, 6 tons lighter than the Leopard 1.
That's probably the only stat that's better than Leopard 1, really, but yeah, okay.
9.48 metres long, 3.1 metres wide, and 2.28 metres high. Crew of 4, so it's quite a low tank. It's a very low-profile tank.
Sorry, I just want to quickly interrupt. Cornelius has joined us on the line. Thank you, Corny. Good to see you. And I've been remiss. Tasman has sent his apologies. He's having a medical procedure, so we hope that all goes really well for you, mate.
Hopefully that's okay.
Yes, when you get to watch us on replay.
All right, there you go. Crew, commander, gunner, loader, and driver. So the French couldn't get their auto loader into this tank, so they actually had to have a 4th crew member inside the tank.
The end of the road for French loaders.
Well, Armour, very thin, only 80 millimetres on parts of the front of the turret and even less than the Leopard 1. So it had about 20 mils on the sides, 35 mils on certain sides, and certain closer to the front, and only 60 mils on the front of the hull, but very heavily sloped, so just adding to the armour. But essentially they decided to go for the idea, the same as the Leopard 1, of, you know what, heat rounds can go through any armour that we're going to throw on these things, so let's just make them small, fast and mobile.
We will get to discuss the history of heat rounds leading up to this in a little while, but it's just worth noting everyone made wrong decisions at this moment of tank history. The British and Americans went with more steel armour. It's also a bad decision. The French and Germans went with almost no armour at all, which, as history would show, was also not the right way, but no one could predict where composite armour was going when they were making these design choices.
The Russians knew what the T-64 was doing, they just couldn't afford it.
Yeah, well.
They had composite and ERA. So, anyway, main armament, they had the 105mm Model F1 tank gun. It's a special French gun and not the L7 105mm gun, carrying 50 rounds, whereas the Leopard had the L7 and carried 55 rounds.
So it was in fact the main selling point of this tank was that it wasn't the L7 gun, so they could sell it to countries that the Germans wouldn't.
And the British would not allow them to, Basically, that is...
Sorry, I should have said the British with the L7. Yeah,
but the Germans also had their own rules about selling to military dictatorships.
Yeah.
So they wouldn't. No, so when we say Germans, we mean the West Germans. All right. Secondary arm. It eventually got in. Had a 20mm autocannon F2 gun installed as coax, even though it's not as coax as coax could be. It was close enough to being coax. And they also installed a 7.62 millimeter gun on the turret, on the roof of the turret, and it moved around. It started out as being just a pintle mount for the Lotus hatch, but then they made it into a remote weapon station for the commander's cupola. And it also started out with a 7.62mm gun as the coax, then they went to a 50 cal, then they went to the 20mm autocannon. Now we'll get into that a bit later.
20 mil is a lot of cannon for a coax. I know the British experimented with it with Centurion as well, but you just can't carry a lot of ammunition when the rounds are that size. But anyway.
And it takes a lot of room.
Yeah.
The engine, Hispano-Suiza HS110 multi-fuel 680 horsepower engine. They then upgraded it over time to the 720 horsepower engine, then a 725, then a 950 diesel. But again, we'll get into all that sort of stuff. But it started out with the Hispano-Suiza, which is a French and Spanish company that usually builds airplane parts. But they made... And
the famous 20mm autocannon of World War II. But,
which is also installed in this Hispano-Suiza autocannon. All right. Transmission. So it started out again with a manual. Get that? A manual. 5 forward and 5 reverse gears transmission. And then later on a semi-automatic on the AMX-30 B2.
I mean, the 30B2 was a much better tank than the initial AMX-30. On the other hand, by the time the B2 came out, the rest of the tank world had really advanced on, and it still wasn't fantastic. But, yeah.
I mean, you had the Abrams coming out by that stage.
Yeah.
When they were bringing these out and saying, well, it'd be nice if we had that armour. And, guess what? The Abrams is just as fast, if only twice as heavy.
Double the weight, mind you.
Yeah. Twice as heavy, but just as fast is the important part. So your mobility ideas. And they had firing control systems and ability to fire on the move.
Yeah. And a transmission that didn't break down all the time. Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah. We'll get more about the transmission.
We will
later.
Indeed, yes.
All right. Torsion bar suspension with shock absorbers. What a surprise.
So good decision, but, pretty simple decision by that time as well. Yeah.
All right. Operational range of 600 kilometres, same as the Leopard 1. Maximum speed, 65 k's an hour, same as the Leopard 1. Supposedly the Leopard 1 I could only do about 63, but close enough for bookkeeping. Anyway, as I was saying before, War Thunder says that the reverse speed of the AMX-30 is 65 kilometres an hour, which the Leopard 1 only does 25 kilometres an hour in reverse. Only 25, says the T-72, which does, what, 9? So 4, 5. Now, I did think this was an intentional dig at the French, or as not... as I couldn't find any other mentions of the reverse speed, and I don't trust Google AI that much these days. And I haven't bought the AMX-30 Main Battle Tank Enthusiasts manual, available from the Tank Museum of Bovington for $13. But with 5 forward and 5 reverse gears, it's probably true that they can go just as fast.
As I said before, and I'd base this on speculation, not actual knowledge, but there are gearboxes where you can just make the reverse gear the same as the forward and back gears, and just with a reverser. And I think that might be what they had in place here, but that's just a guess.
Yeah. Design and development. In 1956, the militaries of France, Italy, Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg, which was called Finbel, came together to design their own tank and to replace the US M48s. West Germany also joined later that year to create the Europa Panzer.
Europa Panzer.
And with their powers combined, they were Finabel. This organisation, which, the A in Finabel is Alemannia for West Germany. They set about creating a low-profile, fast 30-ton tank with a 105mm gun with a petrol engine that had a range of at least 350 kilometres, with both France and Germany producing two prototypes to look at from there. Then, when Charles de Gaulle came to power in France in 1958, he reshaped France into the Fifth Republic, which included scrapping the Finabel plan of developing a European nuke, as he did not want to give nukes to Italy and Germany.
That was a good move.
Well,
in terms of keeping French's primacy in Europe as the only nuclear power in Western Europe, plus or minus the British, plus or minus the Russians. But
And after this, Germany was less keen on the collaborative tank effort. De Gaulle then pulled out of OTAN.
Let's remind you, Rob's calling OTAN NATO to be difficult.
No, it is officially the second official language.
Yeah, I've seen it on the thing. It always looks like it's just a mirror image.
Exactly.
Though, but
That's what I always thought as well, until I actually looked it up for this reason. So we're going to say OTAN.
Alan is asking, so in 75 years, the French have only really, in a meaningful sense, deployed 2 main battle tanks? Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, I mean, yes.
Yeah. Okay, that AMX-30 kind of, sort of, but not really.
No, it wasn't. There's so few of them. All right. He then pulled out of OTAN, furthering the rift between the French and the West German military cooperation. Instead, he wanted to focus on French national capabilities. However, that didn't stop the tank designers in ignoring the higher-ups and going ahead with the trial activity, where the prototypes from both France and Germany were put through the paces to see how they performed. Let's just say the Leopard 1 got more purchase orders from the trials than the AMX-30 did. There was more bickering and trying to solve the joint project by saying, how about a German hull and a French turret? But West Germany had already ordered 1,500 L7 tank guns from the UK, and the French wanted the purely European gun. And so it all fell apart in 1964, leading to the separate development of the Leopard 1 and the AMX-30.
Although we do keep comparing them to each other because they had started from the same set of requirements and largely the same design effort. So there are enormous similarities.
Yes, yeah. I mean,
huge differences, though, because the Leopard is a much better tank.
All right, the gun. The CN-105 F1 gun, developed in the 1950s, completed in 1962. The 105mm rifle gun has a longer barrel than the L7, but with a slower twist in the rifling to impart less spin. The French wanted the best of both worlds by being able to fire accurate heat rounds, high explosive anti-tank rounds, without being affected by the rifling, but also the high penetration of the OTAN APFSDS rounds. Had a gun depression of -8 and a 30 degrees of elevation, which is quite high. Did not come with a gun stabilizer, which the Leopard 1 had, so it could not fire accurately on the move. But that's okay, as it didn't have much of anything in the way of a fire control system either, so there's not much point being able to keep the gun steady if you couldn't tell it what to shoot at.
Now, I just want to pause here for a second and go over what was happening with armour and high explosive anti-tank rounds through the 1960s, really through World War II, through the 1960s. Now, hollow charges are not a particularly new technology. They started appearing in mining journals in 1792, although development as an anti-armour weapon would wait until the 1930s. To be technical for a second, the Munro or Newman effect is the focusing of a blast energy by a hollow or void cut on a surface of an explosive. The legend is that someone noticed that embossing on explosives was being carried over into the things they were exploding against, and, you know, that moment of scientific genius where you go, that's funny, what does it do
That's
that?
interesting. Why is that happening?
But for warfighting, what it meant was that an inverted cone of copper with the pointy bit away from the target, backed with high explosive, would form a ferocious jet of copper that would cut through a very thin hole through most things it was directed at. Basically, it delivered a great deal of violence to a very small point over a very short period of time. And the cramped interior of most tanks was a particularly dangerous place to be on the receiving end of one of these things. And for a while, it appeared to invalidate armour because making the diameter of the cone wider increased its power by a square power. but increasing the armour of the target would increase its weight by a square power. So armour couldn't keep up with the offence with this piece of technology for a while. And this is largely why armour on warships disappeared post-World War II, because they were looking at anti-ship missiles. Remember, the Russians were making 2-metre wide anti-ship missiles, firing shape-charged jets that would go through the entire length of the ship if it hit it in the bow. So that's why warships stopped putting armour on at all. And until the invention of composite and spaced armours in the 1970s, 1980s, well, for the Russians a bit earlier, the thinking for tanks was that any protection beyond small arms was just going to be a waste of time because the anti-tank round could be made bigger faster than they could up-armour the tanks. Now, the problem for the French was that spinning the heat round made it less effective, and firing a round from a rifle barrel made the round spin, but the spinning also made the round more accurate out to a great distance. Rob, you take it from here.
All right. So how do you get a heat round to fire accurately down a rifle barrel without spinning? Now, you add fins to it, of course, and they stop the spin. They make it go straight. But if you're the French, they came up with their own idea. It's called the odious G, which I can't remember all the French words were.
They're in French anyway.
They're in French. It's just an acronym for it. Anyway, they placed their heat round inside another projectile with ball bearings in between them. So that round, when it was fired out, the projectile would spin with the rifling, but the inner heat round would not spin. It would be nice and stable. So when the odious G round arrived on target, the outer spinning round could fire accurately out to a long range, but on impact, the inner heat round would not be spinning and could apply its Monroe-Newman effect to the target more effectively. Yes, this made the odious G round more expensive with a smaller payload and incompatible with other OTAN tanks, but it was worth it, supposedly. Plus, APF-SDS rounds weren't around in the 60s yet.
Now, just quickly, there's two problems the French have introduced here, and the big one is that heat rounds are heavier than APF-SDS darts. So for the same chamber pressure, which is largely a hard limit on the breech of the gun, it has to come out slower. And the result of that is that a heat round has to make a three-dimensional parabolic arc to find its target, so your range finding has to be absolutely spot on to hit it. Whereas the much higher muzzle velocities of the much lighter APF-SDS darts allow them to pretty much just put the sights on, adjust very lightly for range and go. And then the French would compound this by not giving the tank a decent fire control system or a decent rangefinder, so that they were, in theory, supposed to be engaging targets out to 3,000 yards, 3 kilometres, but with no way to...
Metric, but...
No way to accurately land the round on the target. Yeah.
There you go. But don't worry, they came up with a nuke to sort those problems
out.
Well,
once you just hit them with a nuke, sure.
All right, then we get on to the OFL 105 F1 APF-SDS French-made 105mm APF-SDS round created in 1981.
Which still would have worked better out of a smoothbore barrel. But yeah, they sort of had this compromise barrel, which did nothing well. But, yeah.
And it was able to be fired from the rifle barrel of the AMX-30. Interestingly, the penetrator dart has an extra section filled with ridged tungsten ball bearings that are designed to take out any tank riders on the target. Which would have
been great in 1942. What were they thinking?
The Russians still had tank riders.
Yeah, but mostly they were all in BMPs by the time this came along.
There will be somebody who says, I can't be bothered walking. Can I get a lift?
But also, if you hit a Russian tank with around the explosive reactive armors going off, the tank riders aren't having a good day anyway. I don't see why you need to lumber your penetrator with extra ball bearings just in case you want to make a loud bang when you're
the page I found on it was a case of, there was an explosive ordnance person who'd gotten hold of one of these rounds, cut open the top of it, and had found these things in there, and it was asking the internet, why are these here? And the only one person said, look, I've got a pamphlet, it's in French, I've translated it, and I think it means it's there to take out the any tank riders type thing. So I thought, right. Okay. So it was not an obvious thing, and it's not really listed anywhere else. He showed us, look, this is me cutting it open. This is what I'm finding in there.
It's an exciting business. You got to have a real happy-go-lucky attitude towards life to be cutting open ammunition. But
you know what you're doing. I'm sure it's fine.
Everyone thinks they know what they're doing until they don't. But yeah.
As I said before, the AMX-30 could not fire O-10 APDS rounds because they they just didn't work. All right. The coax started as a 50 cal, but in 1973 was replaced with a 20mm autocannon that had its own elevation ability that went up to 40 degrees, making it more capable in engaging aircraft and helicopters.
Is that why it's not a fully coax? Because it's not the same axis as the...
That's what I'm going for. I mean, it's my definition. I'm not haven't bothered.
Sure.
I'm sure there are proper definitions for it, but as a tank enthusiast and not actually any sort of person who actually has any real knowledge, I'm just going to say I'm not going to call it proper coax for that reason.
Because there are people who would say that if it doesn't have a coax, it's a self-propelled gun and not a tank. But there are exceptions to every rule in the tank world, and let's take this as one and move on.
There you go. All right. Early export versions were sold with a 7.62mm coax, and an external 7.62mm MG was developed for the Lotus hatch, but this was later installed as a remote weapon station in the commander's cupola. The Hispano-Suiza HS-110 multi-fuel 680 horsepower engine. I found some interesting notes on the engine that not being a rev head meant absolutely nothing to me. But
you're going to tell them to our audience anyway.
But I'm happy to impart them to others who might be. So in the mid-1960s, Hispano-Suiza would attempt to improve on the turbulence chamber as the present designs had high compression ratios, 19.5 to 21, limiting potential for high turbocharging. The solution was the constant pressure combustion chamber, CAP C, and this is related to the VCR engines, which are variable compression ratio engines, in that the compression ratio can be varied, there you go, from 12 to 19, which allows high turbocharging at high loads, where compression ratio will be reduced. However, it is the upper part of the chamber itself which changes rather than the piston. What any of this means, but some of the benefits are even cleaner exhaust, significant reduction in fuel consumption, and massive increase in specific power. They were able to get 400 horsepower out of a Hispano-Suiza 260 horsepower engine. If they had been able to access improved compact turbochargers that only came about during the 70s, they believe they could have gotten 1,200 horsepower instead of the 680 to 720 horsepower out of the Hispano-Suiza 110 engine.
Which just means at the end of the day that the crappy transmission would have broken down even faster. Just the 680 horsepower wasn't a problematic amount of power for a 30-ton tank.
No. That lack meant that France did not get the tank engines of the 1980s. However, in 1980, they did upgrade their engine to a 720 horsepower Hispano-Suiza, and in 1998, as a last upgrade, 500 in-service tanks had a 750 horsepower Renault diesel engine installed.
Sounds like a good move.
Yeah.
Just quickly, Obliteron's joined us from Oregon. Thank you, mate. Good to see you. And Hans is noting that variable compression engines are being sold as new tech these days. Well, military tech and civilian stuff, there's a lag.
As I said, I've got no idea about any of this stuff except the HP pit.
Sure.
Right. The Gravina GHB 200C twin-plated centrifugal clutch coupled to an AMX-5 SD 200D manual transmission was heavily influenced by the German Panther tank.
Which doesn't seem like the best place to draw inspiration from a transmission.
And was based on a project which had begun in 1938. The transmission was one of the AMX-30's major faults and caused a variety of mechanical problems, including that the driver would have to manually change gears at specific times, even if the tank was moving over rough terrain. Why are they so dumb? Eventually, they installed...
It's not that they're dumb, it's that they don't pay attention to the details sometimes, I reckon. But yeah.
Eventually, they installed a semi-automatic transmission in 1980 that fixed the biggest issue for the tank, besides the lack of armour.
But by then it was much too late, because Challengers and Leopard 2s and Abrams were on the market by then.
Yes. Everything else wondering about, they'd already invested and kept it going. All right. Some notes on the tank.
Rob's pouring a beer for those on the audio. There you go. You've done it.
Lovely beer. All right, notes. Because most OTAN tanks were using the L7 gun under license, The UK was able to influence foreign military sales as part of its end user agreements. So the AMX-30 had access to markets the Brits were not willing to sell to. At the same time, the US was telling European countries they weren't allowed to use their patents in colonial wars.
Oh, wasn't that a different time? Oh, God, can you imagine that? Can you imagine if someone said to their colonial war, I don't know, Gaza, no, you can't use our weapons.
Well, they were saying it to almost try to tell Australia that we're only allowed to sell our give our Abrams to Ukraine.
We'll get to that.
Yeah, I know. Anyway, so they couldn't. So their M47s, M48s are saying no, you're not allowed to try and maintain your colonies by blowing up the people you've been subjugating for the last 400 years using our tanks, sorry.
Unless the colonial independence movement was communist, in which case that would change things. But the tanks were just for killing commies and not for other purposes.
Not for maintaining your empire. It's just, you can't maintain an empire, but just you're allowed to kill commies with them.
Because the American banks were waiting to come in and set up their own form of subjugation. Anyway, let's move.
All right. So the tank market for the right-wing dictatorships the CIA had installed had become a little narrower, and the French were willing to fill the gap. The AMX-30 was also lighter, better in desert or sandy environments, and the great style of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, slightly cheaper than the Leopard 1. All right.
But mostly less reservations about selling it.
Because the West Germans also had weren't allowed. Part of their constitution was they're not allowed to sell military gear to right-wing dictatorships.
Well, it's that line out of Yes Minister in this period. You know, the Germans were still reapplying for membership of the human race, so they had to be a little more careful. Yeah.
Extra stowage was available by storing equipment on the outside, strapped to the metal railings you see on the outside of the hull for those people looking at the pictures.
The pictures will be on the website tomorrow, probably. Yeah.
All right. Due to the low height of the tank, the interior was cramped for the four-person crew, with the drivers not allowed to be more than 172 centimetres, 5 foot 6 inches tall.
Well, we can't wait till Nicholas Moran gets in one of these, then, can we?
The commander could be taller with their cupola. So there was one comment on the internet saying, "Yep, I was a 6'3" tank commander of one of these, and it was fine because I could stand on the floor and look out the vision slits of the cupola."
Yeah.
All right. The need for NBC protection meant that it could not be an oscillating turret, and the autoloader that the AMX liked on all their other tanks.
So just quickly for those who aren't familiar with this, with the French lighter tanks, they had a system
AMX-30, the AMX-50.
They basically turned the turret into a clamshell. They mounted the gun to the top shell of the clamshell, and that meant they could get much bigger guns into smaller turrets than would otherwise be possible. But it did mean there were gaps in the turret that were normally just filled with bits of canvas, and that was no good for keeping out the end of the world.
Yeah. It also meant that the autoloaders could line up so rounds could be loaded straight in without the barrel having to
return to battery.
Return to a flat or set position. So you could be, it'll just keep on, it would be connected to where the gun was connected to.
So the oscillating turret was a great design for most things that most people ever use tanks for, but because they were building this with a view to, for whatever reasons that never make any sense of operating after the world has ended, they were going to plant the French flag on the smoking ruins of the world.
That's also why they got the multi-fuel engine.
Yeah.
Which also meant that it could be fitted with a snorkel for fording up to 4 metres of depth. So whereas the oscillating turrets could also not go through water because you can't seal them up. The crew liked that it was low to the ground, as it made it easy to climb on and off of, and was less wear and tear on the knees. But the driver's position was so low that there was lack of visibility when driving over obstacles and ditches. So yeah, you need a bit of a... Now, just to share a nice little anecdote here, there are now some very crazy AI YouTube channels that are putting out videos about tanks and how the AMX-30 is being redeveloped for 2026, and right beside another video on how the Matilda II is also being redeveloped for use in 2026. So just keep an eye out for AI videos that you may not think are totally legitimate.
The New South Wales Lancers with their little running Matilda will be fascinated to learn that they're re-entering service. But
operators of the AMX-30, France. All right, we'll go into that in a little bit. But anyway, the first foreign sale of the AMX-30 was in 1969 when France sold 190 AMX-30Bs and 15 AMX-30D armoured recovery vehicles to the Greek military junta.
I just want to say, for a Greek military junta, That's a very good ratio of ARVs to actual fighty tanks. Normally, the military juntas just want the fighty stuff, and don't. So that was a far-thinking Greek junta. I'm impressed. Inactive account has joined us from Belconnen. Northside represent. Yeah. Was it 2614? You people?
Yeah, well, that's one of them.
Yeah,
that's one of the best ones.
Belco Pride.
Belco Pride.
Home of the giant penis.
The penis owl. Penis owl is ours. For those who don't know what the penis owl is,
Google it.
put in Belconnen penis owl and you'll find out. All right. The next sale was to Franco's Spain. They bought 19 AMX-30Bs in 1970 and built, and then they also allowed to build under license another 180 AMX-30Es, E for España, which means Spanish. Then another 100. They built another 100 tanks in 1979. The AMXs were the first tanks built in Spain and started the nation's tank building / tank assembling industry. This then led them to trying to build their own tank as a replacement, the Lynx tank, in joint development with West Germany. But that project fell apart and they decided to upgrade their AMX-30Es instead. See, no one can work with the Germans. All that attention to detail and turning up on time, not getting 2 hours for lunch, they're unbearable. By maintaining this tank industry, Spain was able to get in on the action of Leopard 2 and began building and assembling their own Leopard 2s from 2003. Those first 19 AMXs were deployed to the Spanish colonial province of Spanish Sahara in 1970, as the US would not allow them to deploy their M47s or M48s patterns there.
There you go, sovereign capability comes straight away, valuable. Now, it's worth remembering, Franco was still ruling Spain. They were a fascist junta.
1976, remember, boys and girls, from the Civil War.
There's a reason why decent countries weren't touching Spain, and looking at Spain's history, they've come a long way. They've still got some way to go in economic development, but considering how held back they were by the
Hans likes our owl.
Okay, good stuff.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Franco was around for a long time, boys and girls, and a lot of people forget that Spain was a military dictatorship until 1976. So, and then they had their own little period of transition, as it was.
Speaking of Spanish North Africa, I once shared a room in a hostel in London with a deserter from the Spanish Foreign Legion. He was not a great guy, but he did have some interesting stories about life in the Spanish Legion, let me tell you.
Good. Yeah, it wouldn't have been fun. Yeah. Anyway, you think the French Foreign Legion at least has resources, prestige, and a bit of renown. The Spanish Foreign Legion, not so much.
Well, I think they had accepted a much lower quality of recruit in this case, though.
Yeah.
So
they don't get all the perks of the French Foreign Legion. Anyway, the AMXs were sent in to help combat rising anti-colonial protests and attacks, but the tanks themselves never saw direct action. Their arrival did lead to greater armed uprisings, though. Assembling the tanks under license, Spain was not allowed to make modifications to the design of the tank, but over time, they'd assembled a greater percentage of the AMX. So it started out they assembled 40%, then 60%, then 80%, and eventually they assembled enough that they could call it their own and were allowed to modify the tank to meet their own needs.
Would have been an interesting contract negotiation where the French were like, well, if you order 1,000 of them, you can do whatever you want, but if you're only ordering 50, then it's got to stay to spec. But, yeah.
All right. Like the French built AMXs, there was trouble with the transmission and they were upgraded over time, including pulling out the French-Spanish Hispano-Suiza 110 multi-fuel engine and replacing it with a German diesel engine. Cyprus supposedly got theirs from Greece. They got 50...
So that's a military junta power move, is to hand it to the ecclesiarchy you're setting up in Cyprus as an offload. That's pretty clever. But
yeah. They got 52 AMX-30 B2s, and they're still active. They got 61 AMX-30Gs. G's, there must have been B's. It must have been a typo. Have been retired, and lots of tanks on that very small island. But there is an active conflict essentially going on there.
Well, Tasman's made a liar of us. He's managed to join us. G'day, Tasman. Good to have you with us. Hopefully you can even up those poll numbers, because way too many people reckon it was Gallic Genius. I think people are mocking me.
Hoping you're okay, Tasman. Yeah. Right. There are also notes saying that the last production run from the French factory in 1989 were for Cyprus. So I'm not exactly sure whether or not it was just the Greeks providing them, or whether or not the French were selling them on
Cypriot military sales is what you call a murky area. But
yeah. I mean, with all the, I can't remember which tank it was. We're talking about Russian tanks there.
Oh yeah,
because there's a lot of Russian money in Cyprus. A lot of money laundering going on through there.
There's a lot of easy banking terms. Yeah.
Nigeria, they bought 16 units and they're currently in storage, not using theirs anymore. The Kingdom of Saud bought 290 AMX-30s, 57 AMX-30D ARVs, and 12 AMX-30H armoured bridge layers from 1976. They still have 140 in service. Venezuela bought 82 AMX-30Bs and 4 AMX-30D ARVs from France in 1973, being upgraded in 1981.
As we look at these numbers...
They remain in service.
As we look at these numbers, it becomes clear the French were offering some very good advice to their customers, saying, if you're going to order this many tanks, you better get this many ARVs, because the ratios seem pretty solid throughout this. And as I said, it seemed unusually wise for a military junta to make that investment. There we go.
Yeah. All right, so... Venezuela bought them as well. Theirs are still in service. UAE, United Arab Emirates, bought 64 AMX-30Bs and 4 ARVs in 1981 and 1983. They retired theirs or into storage, or some of them were given to Bosnia and Herzegovina. Bosnia and Herzegovina got 36 from UAE as aid in 1997 after the various wars happening in that area. Theirs are no longer in service. Chile, they got 42 AMX-30Bs and 10 ARVs from France in 1981 through till 1999, and they were put into reserve in 2004. Iraq, they got theirs during the 80s. They got 5 ARVs in 1981 and 21 AMX-30Rs, which are the short-range anti-air variants, the Rolands.
Find the Rolands, yep.
And 85 AMX AU-F1 self-propelled guns, and they were delivered between 1983 to 1985.
Some of the AMX-30 derived SPGs are absolutely enormous. Like the gun, it's a gun house, not a turret on those things. But
but they're the most probably the most successful variant of the tank, or still being used.
The other interesting thing is how the Middle Eastern countries bought this tank because no one else would sell to them, but they do seem to have enjoyed working with the French on the training and the support, because they did go back for the Leclercs in a big way. So I does think that speaks well to the French after-sales service.
All the trips to various places.
Now, everyone who's voting in the poll Gallic Genius because they don't think it was the worst tank of the Cold War, can you just drop a comment of what you think was the worst tank of the Cold War? I'm interested in this. All right.
What was worse?
Keep going, Rob.
So the Iraqi self-propelled guns were delivered in 1983 through to 1985. They're no longer in use. We were wondering whether or not they were around in Gulf War I, what impact they had there. Qatar ordered 30 AMX-30Bs in 1977, with an additional 24 AMX-30B2s in 1987. They were retired into storage as of 2024. Tunisia acquired an unknown number of ex-Saudi AMX-30s in the 1990s. And Kuwait bought 18 AMX-30 self-propelled guns in 1991 after the Gulf War I.
So they must have liked what they saw of that. They had a good up-close look, and they said, yeah, well,
I think there was just a lot of reconstruction money going around, and they said, yeah, let's grab some of those. French are selling. Almost operators. Going back to the idea that the French would sell tanks to countries the US and the UK and West Germany did not feel comfortable with. In 1964, France was looking to let Israel, under licence, build the hull of the AMX-30, whilst France would provide the turret. But Israel decided they needed more armour, and eventually the cash-strapped Brits were convinced to let them buy the Chieftain. However, the Chieftain deal fell through also.
When they saw what a dud tank it was. But
Spain did look to sell off or export their AMX-30s, first to Indonesia in the 1980s, then to Colombia in the 2000s, but the deals fell through and the tanks were retired from service in 2002. Conflicts. Athens Polytechnic 17th of November, 1973.
Nothing like using your tanks to beat up the students. That's always going to be the dream.
They weren't just students, right? They weren't. All right. A protest against the Greek military junta government that had taken up residence on the campus of the Athens Polytechnic was suppressed when an AMX-30 crashed through the campus gates, leading to bloodshed and conflict. To provide context, the Polytechnic protest was very Andor-like. For those who haven't watched the show,
just go watch the show after this episode.
It's well worth it. But anyway, it was very Andor-like in that the anarchists put up their posters at the front of the campus, but the Marxist communists took them down as they didn't support anarchist ideology, as opposed to the Communist Youth of Greece, who were another organisations, who wanted sexual freedom and social revolution as part of the ideologies of the protest. So just all the competing aspects of your revolutionary parties trying to fight against the fascist government.
Look, I was always really impressed when I was in Wuhan in the mid-90s. A local Chinese showed me around and showed me the bullet marks around the library at the University of Wuhan, because the varying tribes and of Revolutionary Guards had kept fighting for control of the library, because if you had control of the library, you could pass your exams.
All right, and welcome to Paul Hardbottle, who says AI can't drink beer like you guys. We're safe from the AI revolution and being replaced by AI videos of what we do. Yes, this is true.
True.
So totally tanked us where we go.
Also, weirdly enough, we seem to make less errors than AI, and that's odd.
There's a small degree of fact-checking and quality control. Not a huge amount.
But good to see you on the line, Paul.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you for joining us. All right. This was the beginning of the fall of the junta, as popular uprisings against the government continued through the summer of 1974, when the junta collapsed. The street marches always aimed to end up in front of the US Embassy in Athens to protest the CIA installation of the junta. The AMX-30 involved is now preserved at the Greek Army Training Centre as part of their history of smashing. We're going to smash the oinks. Yeah, anyway, Gulf War I. Right, the Battle of Kafji. Kafji, how do you want to say that one? Close enough? Anyway.
Yeah, yep.
All right, from 29th to the 31st of January 1991, before Desert Storm kicked off, Saddam Hussein had been trying to draw coalition forces into a ground war, but when that failed, he went on the offensive and marched south from Kuwait and into the Saudi city of Kafji, while the higher-ups of the coalition were so busy with the air war that they failed to read the reports saying Iraqi forces were massing for an attack. Saudi infantry mounted in armoured cars, and a battalion of Qatari AMX-30s requested to lead the effort to retake Kafji on 30th of January 1991, supported by US Marines against 3 Iraqi divisions. The Qatari AMX-30s destroyed or captured many T-55s. The total of the battle was 90 Iraqi AFVs destroyed in total by coalition forces, with 1 AMX-30 lost to a 100mm T-55 round. The French also deployed during Desert Storm with 44 AMX-30 B2, including 6 with ex-Soviet mine rollers attached to the front of them, as part of Operation Dago, which means young stag, on the far left flank of the attack to take As Salman airfield. So basically, they were the furthest northwest of the coalition forces. And they were there to block the road from Baghdad to Kuwait to prevent any new Iraqi forces reinforcing Kuwait and to prevent any Iraqi forces fleeing the engagement from getting back out. The AMXs fired 270 rounds in their advance, taking out a number of Iraqi tanks with no losses. There is some speculation that the French were given the role of securing the flank, where they would mostly face T-55s, not being pitted against T-72s, which the AMX-30s would have had been more vulnerable to. So basically, they're saying, yeah, you can play in this event, but we're going to keep you on the sidelines, so not too much bad things happen.
Just up against the second string, really. The second 15, as we would say in rugby parlance.
Yes. Yes. All right. The Saudi AMX-30s have been involved in the conflict with Houthi forces in Yemen since 2015. 2 tanks were destroyed in November 2016 near Al-Kubar by Houthi forces, and as other tanks destroyed in that conflict have been identified as Abrams tanks, and these ones were not identified as Abrams. Quite possible these 2 were AMX-30s, but I couldn't find anything in English to tell me otherwise.
The Houthis have destroyed a lot of tanks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And here's a fun one, again, going from Google AI. When I asked about AMX-30s being involved in conflicts, it told me that the Mexican Civil War, either in 1858 or 1910, it didn't say, the AMX-30 B2 was used by Mexican federal forces against communist rebels. The tank's gun was effective against Soviet-made tanks, but its thin armour led to frequent evasive manoeuvres. Applique armour and briefly ERA armour were added to improve protection, but federal forces were ultimately defeated. So always check your sources, folks.
Yeah, let's just reiterate that was not a thing that happened.
No, it did not happen. All right. And the other one was that France has been involved in many conflicts since the AMX-30 was put into service, so it's a little surprising it hasn't been deployed more. The French Foreign Legion do have the 1st Foreign Cavalry Regiment, but they did not receive AMX-30s. No.
I'd say they might be picky in what they take as well, but that's just a guess.
They're a light infantry unit with trying to basically keep everybody as soldiers rather than logisticians or anything else, and that's all provided by the French military. However, the most service in conflicts has been the AMX-30 AUF-1, which is the 155mm self-propelled gun, which has seen service with Iraq during the Iraq War, with the French in 1995 as part of the OTAN forces in the former Yugoslav republics. I can't remember which bits because it's all just... And used by the Saudis against the Houthis in Yemen. Models.
Hey, here we go. Not the variants, just the models.
Yes. No, yeah, Tasman's right. The French Foreign Legion do have the AMX-10 RCs, so basically the armoured cars with the big wheels, and they drive them around fast and with their extra wheels to solid wheels in the middle. Anyway, AMX-30A, which was the prototype AMX-30, released prior to 1966. The AMX-30B, which is the first production run of the tank from 1966 to 1970. These came with a 50 cal heavy machine gun as coax. Some of the earliest export versions only had a 7.62mm coax machine gun they have day-only vision, periscope, simplified commander's cupola, and without the infrared searchlight. Basically, they were very simple.
Simple export models. Yep.
Then in 1971, they upgraded the French AMX-30B, but seem to keep the same name. Some notes say it's the Valois, meaning upgraded, but others say the Valois, not Valois, was the project.
Valorise. There's an acute on your E there, mate.
Was the project to introduce the B2. Anyway, so just the naming of which version of was upgraded, what was upgraded in 1971 was a little bit weird. Anyways, this version modernised the gun stabilisation system and standardised the 20mm coax.
So you could almost say that the B2, if it had been introduced in the 1960s, would have been the best tank in the world, but it was 20 years later and there were many better things around by then.
This one was only 6 years later.
Okay.
Because that was the B. And then
sorry, talking about the B2, but
yes. Anyway, the first major upgrade to the tank was in 1980.
That's what
came out in 1980, which was the AMX-30 B2 with an improved fire control system. Got to be improved when you don't have one, much of one to begin with.
And you really need it when you're lobbing heat shells slowly across the battlefield. Yeah.
And most importantly, the new semi-automatic transmission, fixing the issues of the manual transmission. They also got a laser rangefinder linked into the fire control system.
Which, again, really important to be able to tell the range when you're having to fire in 3 dimensions because your shells are so slow. Yep.
All right. They also came with low light / infrared visions and sensors, basic cameras that could see in the dark, access to the new French APF SDS round, and an upgrade to the engine.
But let's remember, though, once you've got a French APF SDS round, the whole point of the rifle gun and lobbing the heat shells has disappeared, and you really want as the Russians showed with the T-62, a very different gun for firing penetrators. But anyway,
That one can change at that stage. Anyway, in 1998, 500 tanks were fitted with the Renault Mac E9 750 horsepower diesel engine. Then there was the AMX-32. The developmental successor to the AMX-30s. This modernised export variant was first shown in June 1979. It was based on the B2 but equipped with spaced armour and extended protection features against ATGMs. The 20mm autocannon was standardised as well as a 7.62mm cupola, external cupola machine gun. No orders placed for this version.
Now, Alan's just asking, how much did the AMX-30 influence the Brazilian tank, the one the Saudis almost bought? Now, I would suspect it was the Leopard one was a much more of an influence there, but I would need to look that up to say for sure.
I do remember looking at that tank when and its influence and how they lost out to the Abrams, basically because what essentially is America saying, well, if the Saudis are buying tanks from anybody, they're buying our tanks for lots of money rather than your slipshod tank, even though yours...
Oil for tanks, guys, oil for tanks.
Whereas the Brazilian tank actually performed better in a lot of trials than the Abrams. But anyway, I haven't actually... I can't remember much about it, that one, sorry.
But Leopard 1 being very similar, I'm quite sure there was a lot of Leopard 1 influence running around South America at that time. But yeah.
All right, the AMX-30 B2 Brennus, who was a famous Gallic chieftain of the 4th century BC. He defeated the Romans and sacked Rome. It's also an...
Woe to the vanquished. That was Brennus's saying to the Romans.
Was it? There you go. It's also an acronym for an up-armoured reactive bricks applied. This upgrade was 1.7 tonnes of ERA kit of 112 bricks developed by GIAT and installed on the turret in the front of the hull.
Just want to quickly note, in terms of the AMX-30 with the ERA on it, almost all the photos that I've had access to, which isn't to say it's definitive, but a lot of them, was actually the Op4 version that they used to simulate T-72s on the training ground. So anyway, but they, anyway, please continue.
It also needed a new 725 horsepower capable Hispano Suiza engine. The ERA provided the AMX-30 with armour the equivalent of 400 millimetres of rolled homogeneous armour on a 60-degree slope. These were provided to the active AMX-30 tank regiments from 1995. The final experiments on the AMX-30 in the 2000s was to introduce stealth technologies with a newly shaped turret coated in radar absorbent material and reworked air cooling, redrawn hull surfaces, and various tests of numeric and visual camouflage. These were not implemented.
That suggests they did not go well.
No.
But, yeah.
Well, nobody was buying them at that stage. All right, the AMX-40, though, having not been able to get any sales for the AMX-32, GIAT decided they wanted to upgrade it and see if they could get any sales for the AMX-40. And it came with a 120mm gun, composite armour, and while still trying to stay light at 43 tonnes and fast at 70 kilometres an hour in the 1980s. They couldn't find any takers, and the design stalled in 1990. Then there was the AMX-30E. The Spanish version of the tank was a little heavier at 38 tonnes, more roomier inside by having the 50 cal instead of the 20mm autocannon, and an extra fuel tank. Now we get on to the variants. You got the AMX-30D, which is the recovery vehicle. The D stands for Dépanneur Niveleur, or levelling jack, and was the Dozer ARV version of the AMX-30. A total of 105 of these armoured recovery vehicles was ordered in 1972.
I love how as a backronym, the D for Dozer just works fine in English, but was not what the French were trying to do at all.
It came with a 35 and a 20-tonne winch, as well as a 10-tonne crane. A spare power pack was carried for replacement on the battlefield, which could be done in 45 minutes, supposedly. It also mounted a front dozer blade to make sure it didn't move around when you're trying to do all these things. The AMX-30 Pluton, it throws nukes.
Yeah.
Right, boys and girls? Nukes, right? It's a nuclear armed tank.
You know, I mean, the Russians had their PT-76 variant with nukes on it by this time as well. But, yeah, I mean, tactical nukes are one of the greatest wastes of time and effort in human history, because by the time you cross the nuclear threshold, it's all game over anyway. But, yeah.
Still, they had them.
Yep.
Right, the Transporter Erector launcher was developed in 1980 to fire the nuclear-capable 120 kiloton short-range, 120 kilometres, ballistic missile system called Pluton, or Pluto. And I'm assuming that's for plutonium, maybe.
I think just God of the Underworld I'd go with there. But,
okay,
yeah.
there you go. Which is what plutonium is probably named
after.
So anyway,
yeah.
Designed to operate in West Germany against Soviet forces. 100 were built, but only 70 were retained in operations. The other 30 in reserve, just in case.
Just in case you want to lob some more nukes. If you've lobbed a bunch of nukes, you want to lob some more.
All right. I'm going to fill up my beer.
That's all right. I'm just going to refer to the poll, which at the moment we've got 9 votes in and 78% of you have gone with Gallic Genius. Only 22 think the worst tank of the Cold War. I again encourage everyone who thinks there were worse tanks in the Cold War to drop them in the comments. But yeah, let's keep Keep rolling.
I mean, Alan does have, if you go by 1965 as a reference date, West only had 4 60 Chieftain Leo 1s and 30s, AMX-30s. Okay. So that's your options as to what was the worst tank.
Yeah, I think the Chieftain was a better tank than this myself. But
Yeah.
Chieftain wasn't great, but, you know.
They were organised, the Plutons were organised in 5 regiments based in northwest France and phased out in 1993 for the longer range Hades missile launchers.
And I imagine a lot of arguing in strategic arms reductions treaties went with that as well.
Yeah. Right, the AU-F1 self-propelled gun, the most common...
On the screen right now for those on the video feed. But,
the most common non-gun tank variant of the AMX-30 is the 155mm self-propelled howitzer artillery version. It has a fully traversal turret with an autoloader that can fire 8 rounds per minute out to a range of 30 kilometres. The gun can be elevated to 66 degrees, which is really high for a artillery piece, and it carries 42 rounds, so very quickly go through those if you're moving around. The 190 self-propelled guns were delivered starting from 1979. Then we go on to the AMX-30 SPAG project, started in 1969 with a special turret mounting 2 Hispano-Suiza 30mm fast-firing autocannons, as Hispano-Suiza makes lots of stuff for planes, as we were discussing before, for use against the lower altitude attacks identified by the Wheel Noir, Black Eye, fire control system and radar. The guns had 1,200 rounds fired in 5 to 15 round bursts and up to 650 rounds per minute. It was a visual-only radar that suffered in bad weather. And because of this and the cost, the French did not go forward with this version, but the Saudis picked it up in 1975.
It sounds like the Saudis just being like, sure, have some money, give us some stuff. We friends, yeah. I just want to say, Russell Phillips has joined us. G'day, Russell. It's good to see you here. Yes, the UK timing is bad at this time of year, but thank you for joining us.
Yeah. Then there was the AMX-30 Roland surface-to-air missile system with a 16-kilometre radar range and 2 missile launcher tubes. The operators are situated in the front compartment, while the rear one housed a reserve of 8 missiles with an automatic loader. 183 Rolands vehicles were produced in all, starting with an order in 1977. The AMX-30 Shaheen, which means Falcon, maybe, or Peregrine Falcon, developed by Thomson CSF from the SPAG version and the AMX-30 Roland chassis. This surface-to-air missile system version was only built for Saudi Arabia in 1975. It comprised 2 SA-10 Shaheen launchers, which is surface-to-air missile launchers, around a modified turret. The AMX-30 bridge layer, carrying a 22-metre scissor bridge able to take up to 46 tonnes. The only orders were for Saudi Arabia, who got 12 vehicles.
You kind of wonder what the Saudis need bridge layers for.
There's not a whole lot of rivers there, but I guess
there's waddies, but, you know.
There's probably a lot of tank ditches around Israel that they were thinking about, I don't know, something like that.
Yeah, I mean, there are other countries that bought the bridge layers. You see, like, you get a lot of, like Nigeria, they got a lot of rivers to bridge, but yeah.
Then there was the AMX-30 EBDB. That was Buck Rogers, wasn't it? EBDB?
Yeah,
there you go. Mine-clearing vehicles. The French were given old T-72 East German mine rollers to be attached to the front of their AMX-30s. They used 6 of them during Gulf War I. When operating, the turret is turned backwards. Demine stands for deminage or minesweeping.
Yeah, but we all just call it dozer. Yep.
AMX-30 Accra, a bit like the US-built Sheridan. A special version was developed in 1966-67 with a 142mm tank gun able to fire ATGMs as well as HE rounds down the gun. The turret was enlarged also to allow bigger guns like a 120mm smoothbore to fit in. However, due to the cost of the missile program, it was abandoned in 1970.
There was just a doctrinal thing that it seemed like a good idea, and off the top of my head, I would have said it was a good idea to fire missiles down the barrel. But missiles just gain nothing from being fired down the barrel, and you may as well just fire them off the back of the tank. They don't need to be aimed down the barrel.
Or you stick an infantryman and his mate.
Yeah, this is where the IFV becomes a very powerful package, yeah.
There you go. All right, legacy. Here we go. If you are the French, trying to maintain your individuality and specifically your je ne sais quoi outlook on conformity, then the AMX-30 was there for you. All the US lapdogs in OTAN could go jump. You were doing your own thing, and you had the tanks and the nukes to make sure they had to listen to you even when they didn't want to. France was a sovereign nation and not beholden to any other power who could turn off support or tell them the end user agreement on their tanks meant they weren't allowed to use them in a particular way. And if you were a non-Soviet aligned CIA installed military dictatorship or colonial power trying to keep your empire and no one else would sell you tanks, then the French were there for you with their AMX-30, able to cross all but the smallest of bridges, modern enough to defeat any leftover World War II tanks, works well enough in the desert, and slightly cheaper than the Leopard 1. It's the tank you can get when you want to play war and you've got the money for something modern at the time.
Look, I would still say that the design compromises, the thinking that went into the specifications, they just made a few wrong decisions, but they made them very intelligently in the way that the French do so often. They very intelligently thought themselves into a stupid corner with a... we talk about the tank round with the ball bearing races. Okay, that works fine the day it comes out of the factory. What's it like in 10 years' time when it's been sitting on the shelf? Who's getting that out and testing?
In a very sandy, dry place where the grease has dried up.
Yeah, but who's even testing that the ball bearing races are still working? And if you fire it without the ball bearings going, then it's just a bunch of empty weight. You know, why are you taking ball bearings on a holiday? So again, having a dud transmission in a tank that relies on mobility for its protection is a terrible oversight. And who the hell thought that the Panther was the model they wanted for their transmission is, that's just blow your brains out stupidity. And then the lack of range finding or fire control when you're firing a very slow but effective round, but it has to hit its target to be effective. And you're having to loop it in 3 dimensions, which exponentially increases your chance of missing. There's a lot that they got wrong while thinking themselves to what looked on paper to be an unbelievably elegant and sophisticated solution to their problems. Yes. Okay.
So you're saying it's the worst tank of the Cold War, John? Not
yes.
Gallic Genius?
No, I do think it's the worst tank of the Cold War. It's definitely one of the worst tanks of the Cold War. Because it just missed all these gaps between what it was trying to do and what it actually was.
Whereas I think and feel that it was a sign of French sovereignty, able to promote themselves and say, yes, we are French, nobody can tell us what to do, and we can sell these tanks to whoever we want, and we can use these tanks in any way we want, and you can't tell us, nobody can tell us what to do except ourselves.
Now, look, something's happened that's never happened before. Hans has given us $20 as a super thanks. Thank you, Hans. We appreciate it.
In honor of the big, powerful owl, which is what we in Belconnen call the penis owl.
Yeah.
And it actually, the official name
is... Or the dick owl.
But, it is actually the powerful owl.
That's the great powerful owl, I think. But anyway,
it's just the powerful owl.
It's fine.
Anyway.
Okay, now, the poll is running at 70% Gallic Genius, 30% worst tank of the Cold War. I don't mind being voted against by you people. We all know what democracy's worth these days. Now, we have a real treat for you as the halftime break. Good friend of the show, his 3rd time on the show, Dr. Albert Palazzo, is going to talk to us about his new book, which will be...
It might have something to do about sovereignty.
Yeah, a lot to do about sovereignty. He's talking about what Australia could do to get a better defence policy for less money, and with some modest proposals like getting rid of the Australian Navy. Radically transforming, shall we say.
Radically transforming a lot of things.
Yeah. Now, Rob, you and I need to order a coffee mug to give to Al at the pub.
Right, so yes, we'll be...
We've just got a new tradition where once someone's been a guest on the show 3 times, we give them a mug.
I'm discovering this now.
Well, I sent one to Peter.
There you go. Lovely.
Okay. All right. So we're going to that chat, and we'll be back in half an hour. We've got a lot to talk about with tank-related events in the world, and my old sparring partner on the internet has become the US ambassador to Malaysia.
For the moment.
Yeah.
And it hasn't been confirmed by the Malaysians.
Yeah, the Malaysians are not happy, and I wouldn't be either. But all right, let's go to us talking to Albert about his book, which is on sale now, and we'll come back soon, folks. Okay, so it's a great pleasure to be joined once again by Dr. Albert Palazzo, defense academic and let me just check here, former Director of War Studies for the Australian Army. And Albert, you've got a new book coming out. By the time the public sees this, it will have just been out. It's coming out on the 16th of July, correct?
Yes, that's right. It's called the Big Fix: Rebuilding Australia's National Security.
Yeah, and it's quite an ambitious document at a time of, I would say, unprecedented strategic panic in Australia. So certainly, I think it's going to have some interested readers out there.
Well, yes, I hope so, and I hope it'll be able to contribute to the Australia's development of its defense policy. At the moment, I believe that we're on a very bad trajectory, and we need to do something dramatic to get into a position where Australia is actually able to defend itself.
Yeah, I have read the book, which is always helpful for an interview like this. I thought your potted history of Australian strategy, well, Australian military history was excellent in the first couple of chapters in the book. In particular, you got in there on how we squandered the Treaty of Versailles, probably one of a rare moment of strategic independence by Australia. We really messed that up. Um, but it's a grim picture of Australia's history you paint, though. Not inaccurate, but it's a bit sad.
Well, it's also extraordinarily consistent. You know,
Mm.
since 1901, Australia has essentially had one defense policy. Now, no matter how many different defense reviews we've had and updates and recommitments, it always comes back to the same thing. That is to look to a great power partner to be our best buddy. And that used to be the United Kingdom, and then we got abandoned in 1941, and now it's the United States. And our defense policy
And we're going to get
consists,
abandoned in 2026.
that's distinctly on the cards. But our current defense policy is just simply to intensify the relationship with the United States on the assumption that they're going to help us.
Yeah, I like your points
And
about the status quo and how wants to maintain the status quo. However, the world isn't in a status quo type of mindset at the moment, and so us trying to pursue that at all costs might be a bit of a losing strategy.
oh, it definitely is. Australia is swimming against the tide of history, and you don't win when you do that. So, the government fully understands and tells us that the world is in a state of change, that is becoming more dangerous, that the security environment is becoming more complex, and the solution is to continue to do the same thing. Now, that is a losing approach. We need to do something different. And when circumstances change, you change, or else you lose. And this is just a fact that we can point out to countless cases in history where you lose if you don't adjust to the new environment. And the new
Yeah, and the point
environment,
you
our response is let's do the same thing.
Yeah, and your point where you make of the Australian Defence is saying there's an imminent threat, but we're going to build our forces up over the next 30 years, saying, well, if there's an imminent threat, then don't you need your forces now rather than in 30 years' time?
Well, yes. I mean, we need to build up our defense forces. I don't argue against that. I believe we do need to do that. But the things that we're buying won't be here for 15, 20 years. And so there's no thread of logic in what the government is telling the Australian people. And that's why when in this book, The Big Fix, when I drill into the current policy, it just doesn't make any sense. In one level, or the Australian public is being sold a bill of goods here, for which there's no basis in reality. The basis is sentiment. We have always had a great power partner, and so we need a great power partner. And there's no sense that Australia can actually do something on its own.
Yeah, I was struck reading your book in that everything sort of comes back to 1941 in this country's story, and because America sort of stepped into the British role, albeit very unwillingly on America's part, Australia felt nothing had changed, and in fact, the relationship with Britain, which was one of essentially being the same people, and mass migration of British people to Australia. Um, was fundamentally utterly different to the client patron relationship with the US that was largely disinterested.
Yes, I mean, the Australian government likes to point out that, oh, we're old, good friends. It goes back to the Battle of Hamel in 1918, that Australian and Americans have stood side by side. And, this is an entirely misinterpretation of the relationship.
It's a
When
romantic
MacArthur arrived,
romantic interpretation of the relationship whereby we pine and love America, whereas they might have noticed us once or twice, and that's about it.
yes, I mean, most Americans wouldn't be able to find Australia on the map of the globe, to be brutally frank.
To be fair,
And when
they struggle
MacArthur
finding
understood,
their own country.
well, that is true too. But when MacArthur arrived in Melbourne in early 1942, two things occurred. One, Curtin made that great speech that we're turning now to the United States. But MacArthur gave the Curtin government a very direct and pointed message. He told Curtin that we're not here for Australia. I couldn't care less about Australia. Yeah, we're here because you're a convenient piece of real estate, and I'm going to go fight the Japanese from Australia. And if you get into any serious trouble, I don't really care. And
I've always thought
Australia's never
MacArthur.
heard the second half of that message.
Yeah, I've always thought MacArthur was surprisingly kind to Australia for a man who has enormous failings. He was trying to nudge us in our own self-interest in a funny way, I thought. But one part of you that isn't in your book, and I get that it's more political history than defense policy, is that pretty much from the 1960s, every Australian Prime Minister who started thinking about independent strategy has been removed. Whitlam
Very
is the
quickly
famous
removed.
one. But we can go back to Gorton. We can go through it. And it's both sides of politics, Labor and what we call the Liberal Party, the Conservatives here. John Gorton, Gough Whitlam, and then they just towed the line for a long time. And then I would argue Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard and Malcolm Turnbull all stepped out of line and were swiftly removed as a basis. And I mean, it came out in the Snowden and WikiLeaks stuff. We've got members of Parliament who are protected CIA sources, and when the whistle gets blown, they just move the Prime Minister out. So it's not a winning political move to start thinking independently, and I suspect that might be the root cause of why we have this atrophied strategy view in Australia.
I sort of disagree somewhat
Mhm.
because I think it's actually worse than what you're portraying. I mean, I gave a talk in Perth about this, and essentially, I think there's an element of laziness and an element of lack of imagination. Looking to America is very easy. Protecting your country, dealing with defense is very difficult. This is a hard job. And it's the most important and single purpose for why we actually have a government. And it
So you think
requires a
the
lot of energy and work. And
so you think the
to be
Australian attitude
brutally,
of saying she'll be right, mate, is a bit of a problem for us. We don't have enough
oh
hard-minded
yeah,
people who
yeah,
actually want to do the work.
yes, there are definite cultural factors in Australia's dependence on the United States, and there's definitely anti-intellectual factors that underpin its dependency on the United States. And frankly, handing over our security to the United States is simply easy, and it's also cheap. So, and that was very valid, but it's now changing. The circumstances are changing. And the cost of the security that the United States, that illusion of security, is going up. And we don't seem to be aware of this, or our leaders don't seem to be aware of it, is that the cost of the relationship is now unfavorable to Australia.
Now, I
Yeah.
do like
Sorry, go, Rob.
I do like that. Not only do you go through these points in your book and how there are these issues, but you also go into, well, here are some ideas and some process to go forward for the Australian military and for the government, and these are some of the choices they can make that still maintain the special relationship, that still maintain Australia's sovereignty, which is something we've given up on, and still maintain the ability to build a good defence, and that's really useful to get people thinking. If they actually getting around, if I hope more people read the book so that they can have these ideas of saying, well, why aren't we doing this? Why aren't we getting more uncrewed systems like the Foxbat and Stingray and everything else? They're developing them and building the technology, but why aren't they looking to actually fund them rather than just announcing them, but actually putting the funding in, which is what you've pointed out, saying all these deliverables that are being announced, but no funding is provided for them.
Yeah, I'll let you in on one of the great secrets of the Australian Defence Force. Most people assume that the function of the Australian Defence Force is to defend Australia. And that's not true. The Australian Defence Force we're building is meant to be a sub-element of the US Defense Force. Our Navy is designed to integrate with the US. Our Air Force is essentially a wing of the US Air Force. And our soldiers are very comfortable working under the command of American commanders. And we integrate ourselves at all levels into the American system. And it's actually quite impossible for Australia, the Australian Defence Force, to fight on its own. It can't do it. It has to be part of the American network in order to be able to function. And we're making this even worse because the government objective now is to be interchangeable with the American military. Now that's unprecedented. Nobody has ever done that before. The word used to be interconnected,
Interoperable.
interoperable. Interchangeable means you have the same interests, you have the same strategy. And our government seems to have forgotten that we're actually different countries with different values and different interests. And so we can't be interchangeable. And we need a defense force whose primary purpose is to defend Australia. And that's not what we're getting.
Yeah, one of the things I did like was the simplicity with which you laid out in the book that, and it's bloody obvious when you look at a map, but we don't seem to think of it too often, is that we're a large island continent with significant air-sea gaps, and defending Australia should be a matter of having systems to defend that air-sea gap and be on the strategic defensive, I think is the term you use. Yeah, obviously that would require a very different sort of defense force, but it's entirely doable for less than the cost of these submarines.
Oh, absolutely. Not only can we defend Australia on our own by embracing the new technologies that are coming, but we can probably do it for less. I mean, our current obsession with acquiring nuclear powered submarines is basically cannibalizing the defense budget, and we're seeing all kinds of other things being neglected or postponed. Just recently, we decided, the Department of Defense decided to postpone the development of a capability to make 155 artillery rounds in Australia. This is one of the simplest things to make. I mean, the world's been doing it since 1941. Yet we don't do it here because
Yeah,
it's not the priority.
And they're the most common things that are getting shipped to Ukraine at the moment, and probably Russia. And in the case of everybody in the
Yeah.
world wants them, and you need lots of them if you're in any sort of conflict. And suddenly we're not
Yes.
producing them.
So, as I say in the book, what Australia needs to start with is first accepting a different cultural rationalization for defense policy. And that's where what is called the strategic defensive. Right now, we're a sub element of the US military. What we need to adopt is the strategic defensive, which is I need to point out that I'm not inventing this. It's not a term I've coined. It's been around for centuries, or longer. It's been used in countless times and successfully. And for Australia, it's the ideal military philosophy. And with us being an island and distant from the centers of real tension in the world, and also with the new weapons that are coming online that favor the defense, being a defensive state makes a lot of sense for Australia. It may not make sense for the United States. They're an offensive power, but it doesn't make any sense for us to be an offensive power. And when you become a defensive power, things change. You buy different stuff, you think differently, you train differently, and you become, a sovereign country whose military exists for the protection of its own people.
Yeah, now you do make some, shall we say, modest proposals for the future of Australian defence in the book. Abolishing the Navy, certainly seems like quite a,
Not abolishing the Navy, just reducing the number of crewed vessels. So yes, you're not going to have as many commanders on board their own ships being, yeah. But yes, there are plenty
Well,
of.
we talk about how circumstances are changing, how the world is changing. And for the Navy, and it's really for the Navy, the biggest changes are occurring at sea. But our Navy doesn't realize this, or if they realize it, they refuse to accept it. Our Navy is like the horse soldiers of the 19th century and the early 20th century. Mechanization is coming. The future is with armor and the internal combustion engine. But our Navy is insisting on, don't worry, we're still relevant. We're going to keep doing exactly what we do. And this is a doomed initiative. So our plans to build nuclear-powered submarines and surface combatants, which it's going to cost us, $500 billion, $500 billion, is pointless. And the reason it's pointless is because the purpose of warships has always been to control the sea. You control the sea from the sea with warships that fought other warships. But the big change that we're facing today is not, drones and precision weapons. Now, that's part of it. That's the tech side of it. But the biggest change we're facing is that it's now possible to control the important parts of the sea from the land and from the air. And that means surface warships are now doomed, and submarines also doomed. So let's not build them. Let's build stuff that can control the sea from the land and from the air. And so we'll still have a Navy, but the Navy will consist of, thousands of uncrewed platforms of various sizes and purposes. And most of the Navy will be ashore in, stations controlling these platforms from the shore. So there's still going to be sailors. It's just that they won't stride across the deck, the bridge of a massive warship and feel the powerful vibrations through the soles of their feet. They're going to be underground somewhere,
That'll be the
underground in
Army's.
a bunker.
That'll be the army's job nowadays with the literal warfare. It'll be the army going from sea to shore and shore to sea. So it'll be a bit of a change of role for the two of them.
Yes, for now, all the services will be changing in form and function. And since Australia is surrounded by water, we're an island. Controlling the sea is the most important element of our defense policy. And we don't need to do that with expensive and vulnerable warships. You just do it from the land.
Uh,
And yeah, go ahead, John.
Oh no, I was just going to ask, given that we are a tank podcast, where do you see certainly the future of the Australian Army and in this system that you're envisaging?
Well, the Australian Army still has a very critical role to perform here. In the first place, a lot of these, excuse me, the Australian Army is acquiring the HIMARS missile. We need to acquire them in bigger numbers, but we're getting them. And this is one of the ways you control the sea. These missiles can reach out over the water and sink anybody that's coming our way. And being a truck-borne platform, not only are they easy to hide, but they're also relatively easy to move. You can ship them overseas or offshore, so you can extend the range. But ultimately, we also want missiles that can strike further than HIMARS. So HIMARS is, you know, HIMARS is the first step of gaining a resurgence of, let's say, coastal defense. That's basically what it is. And we need missiles that will strike much further offshore.
But we're going to need
I like
a lot of them as well, aren't we? Because if you're going to defeat a naval task force that's, got, say, the Chinese might be sending, just as the hypothetical enemy, not that I think the Chinese are going to invade us, a task force with a dozen destroyers and cruisers, then it can probably intercept, several dozen missiles.
Yes.
So we're going to need to be firing hundreds of these things
Oh,
to
yes.
have an effect.
Yes. Yes. You need mass, but you also still need a joint force. So any hostile task force trying to operate in what Australia's waters, or the waters that are of Australia's interest, will need to confront an Australian defense force that jointly operates sea-based weapons, uncrewed weapons. These will be smart mines, smart missile launches, mini submarines that are all controlled remotely. It'll also need to confront with incoming waves of land-based missiles and also air-delivered missiles, plus fleets of drones and other things that we throw at them. So the Australian Defence Force doesn't go away. It remains being a joint tri-service, and you add space in there too, a quad service, jointly trying to defend the approaches to Australia.
And
And
as you're saying,
this is very doable.
In the book, you also point out in the book that, as John was saying, being a tank podcast, we're interested in the armored fighting vehicle side of things. So you point out in the book that, we definitely need tanks and we definitely need armored fighting vehicles in order to protect the people who are going to be manning all these things, because there's no point being sitting in a unarmored truck or out in the open when enemy firepower comes in. You need to be in a protected vehicle in order to survive and keep going.
Yes, nothing in the current trajectory of war suggests that Australia has been granted an exemption from violence, from lethal combat. And so if you want to, operate in this battle space, you need protection. And whether that protection is a tank or an infantry combat vehicle, you need it. Otherwise, you just die. And anybody who says that we don't need tanks, we don't need infantry fighting vehicles, is basically saying they don't mind that soldiers die in large numbers. And because we're going to still need these people, and the defense of Australia can be done from as a coastal command operation, but The other threat that we're facing, which the government consistently ignores, is the national security threat of climate change. And I believe this is a much more dangerous threat to Australia than China. China has no interest in doing anything hostile to Australia. And the more American bases that we build here, we're foolishly making ourselves into a target. We're telling the Chinese, please attack us. But they don't really have an interest in doing that. There's no benefit to them for that. But climate change is a much different and much more dangerous threat. And the reason why it's a threat is that across our region, we have a lot of countries that are, let's say, fragile, socially fractious, resource dependent. And as climate change reduces the global food supply, these countries are going to come under enormous threat and enormous tension and stress. And some of them will come apart. And I think the future in our region is going to be much more violent than we're used to. And as a result, what we called in Somalia ungoverned space. Ungoverned spaces will appear across our region. And our government will have to decide what it's going to do about it, because there's no advantage to Australia to have tracts of ungoverned spaces nearby. And so I believe that that's what the Army is going to be principally, its second equally relevant task will be to be dispatched by the government into the regions to help prop up governments, to help control ungoverned spaces, to stand between warring parties and bring about a restoration of some semblance of peace. And that's going to require, heavy firepower and protection, because it's war. And, that's what wars look like. They're messy and they're violent and they're deadly. And so you need this equipment to help bring about peace and hold the region together as climate change forces states into states of unrest and social disintegration. So it's not a very pleasant future. I'm aware of that. But this is the trajectory climate change will take us to.
Yeah, look,
Yeah.
climate change will displace a lot of people, as you say, because of droughts, running out of food, water, and everything else. So from that, people then move to different areas, and that will then cause stress on on governments and people in those areas, are saying, look, we just want to be able to live and survive. And so displaced people are going to be moving and causing issues throughout these governments. And you're right, Australia's going to have to make a choice whether or not we get involved on where the issues are happening, or get involved when these people start looking to come to Australia and say, look, we can't survive where we were, we need somewhere else, and Australia looks approachable. No matter how many saltwater crocodiles there are, there's probably better than where they left.
Yes, absolutely. Australia is a potential magnet for people in the region, because when the place where you are is no longer survivable, you have a choice. You either move or you die. And then, people will make both choices. But the ones who move, Australia's got to decide, what are we going to do about them?
Yeah, I'm always struck by the way that in historical terms, the movement of the peoples is code for the end of the world, or the end of civilization. It's no
Those
small
damn sea
thing.
peoples.
Yeah. What speaking of the sea though, just quickly, you do talk in the book about for big picture strategy for Australia as a trading nation, we're utterly reliant on foreign shipping lines who will not come near us if we're under any sort of maritime embargo or blockade, I should say. So in terms of strategy, building up a sovereign shipping fleet seems like something we really, really, really should be doing. But traditionally, Australian governments hate maritime unions, and do you think we're ever going to get past that, or we're just going to leave that waiting until there's a crisis?
Well, a few years ago now, I think it's just perhaps only 3 years ago, the Australian government commissioned a study into building up a national maritime fleet. And the recommendation was that, oh, we probably could use 12 ships, which is just nonsense. I mean, it doesn't solve even a fraction of the problem. For the last year that statistics are available, 6,000 ships called in an Australian port. And we think, oh, 12, that's the number. So that's a solution to nothing. Should we have a national fleet? I don't think there's there's the interest, the desire, or the money in doing it. So I don't expect it to happen. But we can solve a lot of these problems by just building up our internal resilience. And there are certain industries that are just critical that need to be built up and supported. And I'll identify a couple of them, such as, fertilizer. If you want food, you need fertilizer. It's that simple. And we have the ability, we have a few plants that make it, and we should make sure that those plants survive, even if they need to be taken over by the government. And our other critical, shortage is diesel fuel, which all of it comes from overseas. And there's now there's a solution to diesel and petroleum and petrol. It's called electrification. So if we electrify our transport fleet, then we don't have to worry about the collapse of Australian civilization. Because I'll tell you, right now, if our diesel fuel is interrupted from coming from overseas, supermarkets will be out of food in about 2 weeks. And you can imagine what happens when supermarkets don't have food in Australian cities.
Yeah, the movement of the peoples comes to mind here. Yeah.
So, we can the trade issues are manageable with a degree of imagination, common sense, and a commitment by the government to, take on, the fossil fuel industries and electrify the economy.
Just before
we could easily be a global powerhouse of energy.
That would
Sorry,
be
John, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, one thing that struck me in recent developments, particularly looking at Israel, Iran, Ukraine, Russia, is that all of these new drone capabilities are essentially driven by whether Alibaba will ship to you. None of these countries can build these weapons without the Chinese shipping huge quantities of components to them. Which does make war with China a particularly losing proposition, I would have thought. But
you think, yeah.
I guess the question is, if we're thinking of fighting a war, we need adequate stockpiles, which is something we've never been very good at either, because traditionally the supply has been left to our great power allies.
That's true. Exactly. Our critical component supply lines all go through the great powers. If you want to be sovereign, you have to make microchips, and we don't do that. So clearly, the solution here is not going to war with China. There's not going to be any winners in such a conflict. There's going to be a lot of losers, and Australia, needs to be a vehicle for promoting accommodation and resolution of tensions between the great powers. We just can't be on the sidelines being a cheerleader or a mini-me for the United States. Because nothing is more foolish in the future than to have a war between great powers. We used to understand this during the Cold War. Everyone recognized the possibility of a war between Russia and between the Soviet Union and the United States would be the end of the world. Now, it's the same thing. A war between the United States and China, if it crosses the nuclear escalation threshold, which is very probable, I would say, then we're looking at the end of the world. And yet we have these cheerleaders who, think having a war between China and the United States is a great thing. And hey, we want to be there too, just like in Vietnam. Let's go.
Yeah, I've always been impressed by the way Liechtenstein in I think 1912 decoupled themselves from the Austrian Empire and signed up with Switzerland, and in the process became one of the richest countries on earth by staying the hell out of World War One. And yeah. Okay, Rob, you got any other questions?
I have lots, but I think we better give Al back his day because, as I said before, I could talk about this all day. Had a lot of fun learning about the transparency of the sea and how submarines won't be able to work anymore, how we need to protect our cyber space, because essentially that's going to, if we're going to be having any of these uncrewed systems going, then we need to be able to control them from somewhere. And to do that, you need secure cyber. And how are we going to pay for all this? Because the government loves to announce things, but doesn't actually fund them. So these are all things that Al discusses in his books and solutions for them and what we should be doing. So encourage everybody who's listening and seeing us to go out and get the book once it's out. And it was a good read, and I really appreciate it, Al. Thank you.
Yes, it'll be out on 16 July. Just go to your local bookshop.
Or use on Amazon. Yep.
The Big Fix, it's called.
Yep. All right. Thanks very much, Al.
Rob, John, it's been a pleasure. Always happy to chat with you.
We'll see you at the pub next month. And we're back. Thanks to Albert once again for giving us his time to talk about his new book, The Big Fix, and how Australia can defend itself properly and establish our national sovereignty. I'm looking forward to catching up with him in the pub again in a couple of weeks, where John has a special present for him.
Well, we hope so. But yes. All right. So it's time, Rob, to thank the patrons. So let's switch over to that. Yes. The folks on the inside group chat that Pete Hebseth couldn't mess up. Our Artificer tier, they get the interview early and the ad-free video and audio of the show. We have Brian Jenkins, Chicago John, Chris Peze, Cornelius Weber, Johnny Oot, Late Apex, Maxi Mixed, Monty, and Pear. Meanwhile, in the Apprentice tier, who get the audio and video ad-free, we have Anton Gorbanov, Callum King, Carter Heller, Christoph Keller, Dan Sapienza, David Mulvaney, Elliot Spicer, Floaty Burb, Guy Hook, Hans Wang, Henry Hemmed, Jay Backman Strauss, James Van Dyke, Jamie Stokes, Red Rum X, Russell Phillips, Scotch 12, Steve Broomfield, Steve Matthews, and Tony L. And we just want to remind people, if you are thinking of joining us as a patron, do it via the website, not on an iDevice like an iPhone, because then Apple will take more money. We have one person who's donating that way. And hey, that's fine. We appreciate it, but you will give us more money if you do it through the website. Anyway, and Apple's got enough money. They're fine. Yes.
Check out the website.
TotallyTank.net. Yes, it has all the links for all the things you want to join.
I want to say hello to some of the folks in the comments. Yes, electric vehicles are charged with renewable energies in the ACT here where we are, at least, rather than fossil fuels.
Most people with an EV have put some solar panels on their roof and charge when the sun's shining.
Australia has the most solar panels, I think, in the world or something like that.
Home solar per capita, something like that. Yeah, because even people who don't give a stuff about the environment have figured out, hey, there's free money falling out of the sky if I just put some panels on.
As people keep telling us, this case of the worst solar position in Australia is better than pretty much the rest of Europe or North America.
Although, I did thoroughly enjoy working in ACT government when people started putting their solar panels on, and then they were like, these trees are blocking my solar access. These trees have to go. And
I chopped my trees back the other week.
Well, anyway, let's not talk about.
I saw my numbers going down. Well, I can figure out why that is because I haven't chopped those trees back.
Back. You're not chopping them down, though.
No,
the trees are fine. Okay,
they're fine.
All right,
they're being shaped.
Let's move on. So, Rob, Oz Armour Fest 2025 is coming up soon.
Yes, start booking your tickets.
We have one more podcast to go before we get to Oz Armour Fest, though, which makes it feel like forever away. But you should probably have your tickets already, but it's not too late. Look, there's a link up on totallytank.net, but also on our Facebook page. I've started a Facebook event just so I'm not bothering the rest of our audience with, hey, I'm at the pub, where are you? All that sort of chit chat that we're going to have. So if you're coming to Cairns and you want to meet up, head over to our Facebook page, sign up for the event, and we can give you updates of where we're at and what we're doing and how to find us. Yeah.
So end of August next month. We're putting money on the bar. We've heard a rumour that Sabaton will be there. We may have started that rumour. We're hoping it's going to come true.
Let's work on what's definitely happening. We're definitely going to be there. There's going to be tanks. There's going to be beer. There's going to be late nights in Cairns, drinking beer, talking about tanks.
I don't think it'll be that late night. I think it'll be maybe.
No, we'll be home by midnight.
We're guys in our 50s now.
Yeah.
We're not going to be out there. And we're going to be getting up the next morning to go ride in tanks, which you do.
Yeah.
At the tank museum.
But basically, you don't need to be out of bed before 9 to still do the tank museum. So you can have a reasonably big night and still be fine. There's no early mornings. Yes, Russell's noting the YouTube adverts are making him appreciate the ad-free patron feed even more. Hooray.
All right. And now, regarding his point that there's you can't remember an AMX-30 at Bovington, it might be that they only brought it over for a particular event from Samoa and Samu, and it went home after that. Possibly, I don't know.
Yes.
I haven't actually checked that out too much.
Let's Tank Festival.
We've done the Tank Festival.
Yes.
There will be money on the bar. So come along, wear a T-shirt, join us.
Also,
tanks.
The first 15 listeners of the show who come up to me over the course of the festival, I will give a Total Tank pin to.
Pin?
Yeah.
I don't have a pin.
Yeah, well,
I better get it. I better come and talk to you.
Yeah,
then.
you can order a pin. Buy your own pin.
Buy my own pin. All right. Now we will get into the beer review. We just have to clear the decks, as it were. But we'll be into that in a moment, and we'll be talking about the obviously the very, 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 very French beer that I bought for today's episode, which is not a
We'll talk about that. Now, in the general world of tanks, a new Chinese T-72 upgrade has been spotted in the wild, Rob.
Do you mean the blue box of?
It might not be the blue box. No one knows what's in the blue box.
Oh, so I only saw the episode. I only saw the article about the blue box.
So there's a lot of talk. And mostly, I'm the one doing it at the moment. The Russian T-90s being produced now, and the Russians are ramping up their T-90 production, probably don't have the French fire control system that the original T-90s had.
No, they had to develop their own after 2014. Yeah.
Well, and particularly after invading Ukraine. But so what I am suspecting is there's a lot of Chinese components in the new T-90s. And I would furthermore suspect that the input the Chinese are getting from the Russians about what they need for the Russian T-90s are going back into what the Chinese are looking at with their T-72 upgrade program.
Right.
Because fundamentally, Chinese electronics is, if not the best in the world right now.
One for you, one for me. One for you, one for me.
Yeah.
I mean, why wouldn't you?
The Chinese have got the electronics, and they've got
their optics have improved a whole lot in the last 20 years, boys and girls. Let's just put it that way.
But also, even if you're just going back, even if you've only got 1990s level optics, that's still. That still made for very effective.
That's still 20 years more than the Abrams.
That's very mean, Rob. That's very mean.
I'm saying the Abrams is old, but anyway, it's still a great take. All right, don't get me wrong.
Yeah. Now, talking about
shitification.
Well, talking about strategic options for countries,
sovereignty.
We're here in Australia, and we don't want to be attacking our American audience. We love you guys.
No, God, yeah.
But most of you who are still watching this show are also a bit concerned about your government. Probably terrified, in fact. But out here in your allies' countries, we are beyond furious because we have
scared as well.
And scared. We're absolutely terrified because our alliance relationships that we depended on are evaporating, and we are dealing with a hostile nation that is meant to be our ally, and this is terrifying. Wired magazine, which is an American publication, has written an article, feature article this week on the enshittification of American power, which they have described as hegemonetization.
So that term enshittification came from Cory Doctorow, who is a great commentator,
futurist
of the way the world is, and quite likes a lot of his writings and where they're going. So basically how taking something and making it worse and forcing it upon everybody, I guess is a encapsulation of the word.
But it's also the way that, say, America went around the world saying, be an American ally, agree to some certain rules that we impose and have peace and security. And a lot of the world said, this sounds awesome, we're signing up for this.
It's simple, it makes sense, it's logical, it benefits all involved. I mean, why wouldn't you want to do that? And yet...
But then you get to the point in Empire Strikes Back where Darth Vader turns to Lando Calrissian and says, the deal has changed. Pray we don't change it any further. And that's where the rest of the world is at right now, dealing with America. The significance of this article isn't so much what it says, although that, if you haven't already thought about these things, is well worth thinking about. It's that it's from an American publication. And they're saying, oh my God, our allies are getting absolutely terrified by what's going on. And let me tell you, as one of America's allies, we are absolutely crapping the bed right now. So, yeah, that's... Yeah, Blitteron saying, speaking from the Imperial Core, dump us, disconnect us, leave us in the dust. Look, there's still a lot of white-knuckle terror involved for the rest of us. Although I would add, not as much white-knuckle terror as being an American citizen would involve right now. So we feel your pain, guys.
Or when the Imperials took over Cloud City.
Yes. Tasman's noting the Australian M1s who have arrived in Ukraine. They're in the run sheet already, Tasman. We will get to those.
You bet we will.
But yes, so we will return to the subject of American hegemonetization because we have a cracker of a thing to talk about. But Rob, you wanted to talk about the US Marine Tomahawk missiles.
No, I want to talk about beer.
We need to drink the beer, though. So,
all right. US Tomahawk. So the US Marines said, you know what? These Tomahawk missiles, which have a decent range and do a lot of stuff, they're a bit big. And they've turned off their Tomahawks, which have just been sold to Australia. Australia is only the second country, I think,
after the UK.
After the UK, who've been allowed to buy Tomahawks.
A very aging strike platform. Having said that, the thing about the Tomahawk is people are like, oh, it's slow and it's not stealthy. True, but it can fly very, very low with some really advanced mathematics to map out topography. And that's why it remains viable. But it's a very old platform, and it's useful for hitting static targets, and that's pretty much it. But yeah.
Anyway, so Australia's just been sold Tomahawks because we like giving money to the US government. While at the same time, the tankless US Marines are rejecting theirs. The US Marine Corps is cutting its Tomahawk missile program, going for the nimble Navy Marine Corps Expeditionary Ship Interdiction System, called Nemesis, without funny spellings.
You know, when the acronym is sexy, you just know it's a dud program. But let's call that Griffith's Law and move on. I'm pretty sure someone saw that before me.
All right. The Marine Long Range Fire Launchers, the
LRF, that's not sexy. That's probably okay.
No, that's simple. Launchers of the Tomahawks couldn't operate, were too big to operate effectively in the expeditionary and littoral environments the Marines expect to operate in. The Nemesis launcher, on the other hand, is based upon the Joint Light Tactical Vehicle, is uncrewed, with Marines controlling the vehicles and firing the missiles from a safe distance. So basically, they could drive these uncrewed vehicles around the place. They're much smaller, and they could fire them remotely. So away they go.
Yeah, you've still got the problem with all of these. Like you can slap some missiles on a truck, but when it's trying to target
which is what Australia's doing.
Yeah, but when you're trying to target things 400 miles away, it's a case of how are you acquiring that target? How are you making sure that target isn't in fact an Indonesian roll-on, roll-off ferry or a hospital ship, as opposed to the invasion strike force? And that requires a much more complicated set of actually much more important assets.
Which is especially true if Elon decides to turn off your secure GPS positioning for your missile and your position and the target.
Yeah.
And that's all in his hands, and that's what you're relying on.
Yeah, so I'm not personally a fan of just slapping missiles on trucks and saying good work, chaps, because you need to figure out how you're going to find the target and identify the target, and and then it's relatively simple. The simpler part is firing a missile from somewhere and obliterating the target, but the finding and the identifying is the hard bit.
All right, Tasman. Mm-hmm. You've said sorry about not realising about talking about the M1 Abrams arriving in Ukraine. Do not worry, my friend. We will get there. Do not. You no need to be sorry.
No, it's fine. It's fine. It's okay.
It's fine.
Right.
Okay. Right. New Chinese tanks.
These might be the upgraded T-72s. We don't know, because through the streets of Beijing have been seen something that might be tanks with these enormous blue boxes stuck on the outside of them, which it was sunshade, I think the British called it, when they were making their tanks look like trucks. But there's definitely something the Chinese are rumbling around their cities that are probably tanks, but they don't want prying eyes to see.
There is some speculation that they're just simulated vehicles for when a parade is going to happen on those roads at a later date. They're saying, okay, this is what, and they're basically preparation and planning. This is saying this is what these vehicles how they will move down these roads when the parade happens in whatever date. Probably what do we say for the Hargo? Not the Hargo.
Chiha.
The Chiha, the
founding of the
and the patriotic tank and the.
I don't think that. Anyway,
Yes.
Chinese can do their parades, but it certainly got people talking that they've managed these. I'm not sure what Alan's saying there, but we'll move on. Okay, tank hats are going global, Rob.
Yep.
Everyone mocked the Russians when they first put hats on their tanks.
But everybody started to look at them
now even the mighty United States is figuring out how to put cope cages on their tanks, because fundamentally drones can't break through chicken wire. And if you make them set off their shaped charge a metre away from your tank's probably going to be in much better shape.
Much better. And chicken wire doesn't cost much. It's a case of, okay, let's standardise the way we apply the chicken wire so that your smoke launchers can go off, your ERA can go off, your active protection systems can go off without blowing up your own tank, right? All those sort of things need to be built into how you want to apply your tank hats. So, and that's now going into all the contracts that have been put out for upgrading various vehicles around the place. Yes.
Anyway, it's funny because everyone mocked the Russian cope cages a few years ago, and now they're integral to everyone's planning. Now, I think we should do the beer review before we hit the next item. Rob, what have we got here? What have you brought us from a French beer? And you know how much I love French beer. Since you and I were in France in 1994, we were sitting in Amiens drinking our first French beers, going, wow.
Was it country? Amiens? I think it was Lille, but anyway.
Sorry, Lille. You're right. Yeah. We were in Lille. They're very close together.
Yes.
Anyway. And we drank French beer and we said, wow, the French actually, they don't have a reputation for their beer, but these beers are really great. But what have you got us? Not a French beer.
No, but it's close to being France. It's Belgium.
It's closer to Lille than most of France, I guess. So we have the Left Blonde.
Left Blonde. 6.6%, 500 ml can.
Nothing like strong beer to enhance our podcasting game, Rob.
Yep. It's from Belgium, for those who don't know. It's on the just over the border from Lille.
Now look how beautiful and clear this is for a beer that tastes like it's mucky with sediment.
Yeah, no, it's not the best taste I've ever had, I can say.
I mean, in terms of a beer connoisseur, this is almost it's Belgian style perfection. It's really good, but it's got a lot of what you would think of as off flavors. And frankly, as a home brewer, if I produced a beer with a lot of these flavors, I'd be like, oh, stuff that one up. But,
established in 1240, because they knew what they're doing back then.
They were not making beer that looked like that in 1240, I can tell you. Because until the invention of coking coal, pale ales and lagers could not exist, because when they peated the malt, it made it dark.
Well,
dark beers were all beers for most of human history.
And as I've said before, I can't find a lot of French beers in Canberra. Even Aldi has gotten rid of their Saint Etienne cheap lager. So, and I thought, right, look, I needed to grab something on the other day, and I said, it
all happened when we were trading them on the submarines. The French beer just disappeared from Australian shelves. And I don't blame them.
There you go. It's all ScoMo's fault.
We treated them appallingly. If Australia had gone to France and said we want to buy nuclear submarines, the French would have been like,
and some
yep,
beer,
no worries.
And some beer, all right? But
instead, we said we want an impossible conventional submarine, and the French said, we'll try our best. And then we said, no, we want the nuclear ones. And they're like, that's what we were trying to sell you in the first place. All right, moving on to something even more farcical than Australian submarine procurement. Rob, it happened about 2 weeks ago. The UK announced they were buying an extra 12 F-35A Joint Strike Fighters.
But were they extra or were they instead of?
No,
the defence minister couldn't tell them at the time.
Yeah, but this is basically a huge extra bung of money to Lockheed Martin.
Really, because do F-35s cost millions of dollars?
Yeah.
How many millions of dollars?
Hundreds of millions each.
Yeah, exactly.
But the hilarious thing with this purchase is the F-35A version only works with a boom refueling system as operated by the US Air Force and not operated by the Royal Air Force. So they can't refuel them. For a nuclear deep strike bomber, which is what they're saying they want them for, that's a bit of a problem that you can't do in-air refueling. It gets worse, though. It gets worse, Rob, because the UK doesn't own any nuclear bombs.
No, because they're American controlled.
They have nuclear warheads on their submarines, but they have no gravity bombs or missile launch bombs to fly from an F-35. So for a nuclear deep strike, it can't be refueled and it has no weapon. That's a very strange thing to spend billions of dollars on. They did say that they might like to do some pilot training with it, which in general is not what you'd think is a good use of a nuclear deep strike platform.
So just to clarify, the difference between the F-35A versus the F-35B, the A's are the
Air Force version.
The Air Force version, whereas
and
the
Bs have VTOL.
Yeah, they can
vertical takeoff and landing.
They can go the ones on the
carrier.
The carriers that the Brits have just gotten after relying on the French for their carriers for the last 10 years.
Yeah. Okay. So it's not, you wouldn't believe you would buy these for pilot training, and it obviously can't do deep strike with no organic refueling for it, and also no deep strike weapon for it. So it really looks like what we're looking at here is an extortion payment, that it's just the US has said we want you to spend more on defence, and they're just like, okay, here's some money.
Would they say that to a country? They want them to spend more on defence and say, you have to buy from us? Would they? I can't believe they'd say that. That's sarcasm, boys and girls. That's exactly what they're saying.
Exactly what
they want a transfer of wealth from other countries to America in order to justify it. I mean...
Now, loop back to what we were talking before about the hedge and monetization of US foreign policy, because this is all happening in real time in front of our eyes.
It's worthwhile reading the Wired article because it does show the level of enshittification that is available. Whether it's just a case of you've been called out by the American government for saying, I want to prosecute these war criminals, and they're saying, well, we don't like you saying that, and therefore we're going to shut down all your bank accounts. So you need to go to the bank, get out a pile of cash, because if you want to pay your solar electricity bill, you need to pay it in cash because your credit cards don't work anymore. That's the level of detail we're working at here.
Yeah, for our American audience, I totally get you're paying attention to the horrible things that happen in your own country, and we totally understand that, but we're here as Australians, so we're going to talk a little bit about how we're seeing this stuff happen. What's happened to Brazil, where they've been hit with extra tariffs, straight up quid pro quo. Trump's announced, if you drop the prosecution of Jair Bolsonaro, we'll drop these tariffs. Now, that is an imprisonable offence in every country in the world, perverting the course of justice. That is absolutely vile that you would say to a country, drop this prosecution against my buddy or I will hit you with a tariff. That is beyond disgusting, and it's not being talked about enough. And the British purchase of these planes that they do not need and can't use It really makes a lot more sense as an extortion payment and makes you wonder what other junk the world will be forced to bleed their taxpayers for. It's crappy. And oh, wait a minute, Rob, what's happening with the submarines?
Well, I think
Eldridge Colby.
there's a review by, as we mentioned last month, there was a review by the Pentagon to say, look, we should check out whether or not this deal is a good deal for America. For Australia to get these AUKUS submarines. And just remember, there are two parts to, as we discussed with Dr. Al, there are two parts to the AUKUS treaty, and it's a case of 1, submarines, 2, technology transfer. Part 1, we pay a lot of money, and when I say a lot of money, I mean a lot of money. Now the Pentagon is saying, well, do we really want to give these guys money? I mean, they're going to string us along.
Pentagon's saying, do we really want to give them submarines? And it's like, we're paying you for submarines, so hand over the submarines, guys. The idea that we're just paying money to improve US submarine production, billions of dollars we've already paid to improve US submarine production, which is weirdly enough not improving submarine production because the companies involved are just like, thank you for the money, and there's no contractual requirement to deliver anything, so we're just going to keep the money, thank you. But also then the idea that we have to promise that we'll use these submarines in some hypothetical war over Taiwan. The US is not committed to that war, but apparently we have to be.
Now, let's just point out that our Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, has spent the last week in China dodging around these questions, and he's done it really well, I've got to say.
Yeah, no, he was very good. He said, a future Australian Parliament will have to decide whether we go to war or not. That's not what we decide right now.
America was trying to push him into the idea of saying, you've got to say you're going to stick it to these bloody Chinese people, and he did very well in negotiating and basically stepping around and saying, look, China is our biggest trade partner. Why would we want to maintain that relationship? At the same time, we need to maintain our relationship with the US, and doing that that dance between all three of them and Taiwan, I think he did really well with that.
He did. I would just say we want to be friends with China, we want to be friends with America, but we don't
spend the money on diplomacy rather than subs that are going to get us into a war that we can't win.
Yeah, but the really nasty thing and the pertinent thing, something for our American audience to think about, is our Prime Minister cannot get a meeting with Donald Trump, whereas Xi Jinping has met with him twice. And I saw this when I was working in the press gallery in Parliament House 20 years ago. So often, American presidents would come to Australia and said, you've got to give us a lot of money and we're all going to send a lot of our children to die in wars together. And the Chinese would come out and say, we're all going to get rich together, let's go eat a banquet. And it was compelling then and it's compelling now, let's get rich together and eat a banquet.
So
if we got a choice.
Albo's got, what, another 6 to 8 months before he gets cooed out?
Yeah, maybe.
Boys and girls. We'll call it 10 months. The same as Stephen Colbert has just been axed by CBS.
Mm-hmm. Now, I did want to talk a bit about my old friend Nick Adams, who's been announced as the US ambassador to Malaysia. Now, this is exciting news, Rob, that any Australian who comes up as a failed young Conservative politician can get themselves on Twitter, make a twat of themselves to the point that many people think they're a joke account, but in the grifter-based chaos of the Trump regime, that tiny Tory can be appointed US ambassador to Malaysia. And going off script here for a second, of the 1,000 most important jobs in the world, US ambassador to Malaysia is probably in that 1,000.
Yeah.
It's an important country in an important place.
If you want to get any sort of shipping through the South China Sea, Malaysia's on your...
got either side,
all your oil that's going from Singapore, and they do a lot of oil, has got to go through Malaysia as well.
Yeah. Now, for people who aren't familiar with the horror of Nick Adams, he is the self-proclaimed alpha male who thinks eating at a titty bar makes you an alpha male. And I would argue, based on my own upbringing and expectations, that the definition of an alpha male is actually being at home with your wife and children. That indicates a certain alpha and maleness.
Arm wrestling.
Yeah.
Probably couldn't win a foot race these days, but arm wrestling, I can take him.
I would get in the ring with Nick Adams, so-called alpha male. Now, young Nick has grown to be 40 these days, but the young Liberal mark never really washes off. Amongst Nick's many outrages was trying to get a waitress sacked for wearing a Free Palestine pin. And that's not going to go down well in an Islamic country like Malaysia.
No, the political parties in Malaysia have already gathered together to
they hate him.
start saying we will not certify him as the ambassador to the US type thing. So we'll see what happens with that next month, I guess. Yeah.
All right, but it does go to show there's opportunity for Australians in the fascist takeover of the US, though. You just need to be such bad people that you've been previously expelled from the Australian Liberal Party, no strangers to obnoxious jerks, for offensive comments to a journalist. So now, technically, I will want to note he resigned from the party before he could be expelled, but you get the drift. He'd risen to the lofty height of Deputy Mayor of Ashfield, which is a city that's produced a colourful array of deputy mayors, many of them in prison at the moment. But he got himself into trouble when the journalist dared to ask him about his attendance record, and his response was insalubrious. I would like to note, though, that in a moment of clarity, he had this to say about his nomination to the role of ambassador to Malaysia. US, not Australian ambassador to Malaysia, the United States ambassador to Malaysia. His comment was, "Delusional self-belief and irrational optimism, along with endless hard work, make anything possible." So that's what we're dealing with here, Rob. But, on the bright side, we can only imagine the plum roll being lined up for Cat Turd 2 if being a Twitter warrior for the armies of darkness is a qualification for higher office. And I think Supreme Allied Commander Europe is the only role that would suit Cat Turd 2.
No idea who that is.
Now, here we go, the bit that Tasman's been waiting for. Off you go, Rob. Give it a roll.
Right. Some Aussie Abrams have made it to Ukraine. Now that the US administration is momentarily pro-Ukraine, they've arrived.
But it's hilarious how they've been held up for 9 months, and Trump has just got pissed off with Putin this month, and suddenly, there's Australian Abrams. They've just rolled back over into Ukraine.
They've arrived, right? So, boys and girls, they're there. Hopefully they can do some good by, as our old mate Big Mac Battle Blogs will say, is killing some orcs.
They're not going to change the course of the war, but Ukraine will definitely, they will save some lives for some time. They'll be burned out. They're not going to last forever. But, and what's more, if they'd arrived 9 months earlier, they might have been a lot more useful.
All right, now, one last check of the AMX-30. The Gallic genius that it was has received
70% of the vote.
Can we see a breakdown of that?
Yeah, 30% worst tank of the Cold War, 10 votes.
10 votes, they're 7 and 3. There you go. Well, the people have spoken. A Gallic genius that the AMX-30 was. It started in 1966. It's still going today. It could launch nukes. It could be sold.
Come on. The Pluton was a very different vehicle.
It could be sold to right-wing dictators all around the world, and it's kept on going, slightly cheaper than the Leopard one. And that's the big selling point. And
available to very dubious customers.
Yeah. And I think, boys and girls, that's what we've got to say for today.
Yeah. I mean, how long have we been going, Rob?
2 hours 10.
Yeah, wow. Okay. Thank you, folks, for watching this far. And
putting up with us.
Yeah.
And thank you for the big, powerful owl.
Yeah, well, thank you, Hans Vornhout, for giving us $20 for the owl.
We'll have to figure out what to do with how to get that now.
Yeah, well, we're working. Google monetization is quite a process, but thank you for that. We will get it. And on that note, we're going to be back. Yeah, thank you, everyone. We're going to be back next month.
Early August. Prior to going up to Cairns for the Tank Fest.
Yeah, I think August 9th, sometime around then was when we're looking at doing the next episode. So a little earlier in the cycle for us, but and then Cairns. We're hopefully going to be drinking some beers with some of you guys.
And live streaming and doing all sorts of fun stuff.
Don't know about the live streaming.
We'll figure it out. All right. There'll be exciting stuff.
Yeah. And yes, Tasman, it will definitely be a World War II tank next. Okay. Thank you, folks. We're out.